November 1944, a divisional ammunition supply point near Thionville, France. The air is heavy with the scent of damp pine and the metallic tang of distant artillery. Mud clings to the tires of every passing truck. Inside a heated wooden shack, a young soldier stands shivering, his jacket torn and his breathing ragged. He has run 2 miles through a killing field to reach this door. His eyes are wide, searching for the crates of .30 caliber rounds that his platoon desperately needs to stay alive. But the officer behind the desk is not looking at the soldier. He is looking at a clipboard. He is checking for a specific sequence of numbers and a set of required signatures that do not exist on the runner's empty hands. The officer offers no bullets. He offers only a demand for paperwork while men are dying in the dirt. It is a moment of bureaucratic coldness that George S. Patton will soon transform into a lesson in blood and lead. November 1944. A damp, shivering forest near Thionville, France. The air smells of wet pine needles and burnt cordite. A 19-year-old soldier collapses against a stack of wooden crates at a divisional supply point. He is covered in mud. His lungs burn from a 2-mile sprint through a mortar barrage. He gasps for air and points toward the distant tree line, where the sound of heavy machine gun fire ripples through the fog. He needs ammunition. His company is pinned down. Their clips are empty. Their belts are dry. They are holding the line with bayonets and prayers. But the officer in charge of the depot does not reach for a crate of .30 caliber rounds. He reaches for a clipboard. He looks at the exhausted messenger and asks for a specific piece of paper. This is the moment a bureaucratic requirement becomes a death sentence. General Patton's response would ensure that no piece of paper ever mattered more than a soldier's life again. November 1944, a muddy supply depot near Thionville, France. Rain falls in a steady gray sheet, turning the earth into a thick paste that clings to every boot and tire. The air is cold, smelling of wet canvas and diesel exhaust. Somewhere to the east, the heavy rumble of artillery vibrates through the ground, constant and unforgiving. A young soldier stands before a desk in a dry, heated office. He is breathing hard. His uniform is torn. He is asking for help. He is asking for the crates of ammunition stacked just 20 yards away behind a locked wire fence. The officer behind the desk does not look up. He does not reach for a key. He reaches for a pen. He demands a specific piece of paper that does not exist in the mud of the front lines. It is a moment where bureaucracy becomes a weapon of war. George Patton is about to show this officer that in a life-or-death struggle, a missing form is no excuse for a missing heartbeat. What Patton did when a supply officer refused ammo to a company in contact because of a missing form. November 1944, a divisional ammunition supply point near Thionville, France. The air is heavy with the smell of wet earth and cordite. Mud clings to the tires of idling trucks. A young runner collapses against a wooden counter, his lungs burning and his uniform soaked with sweat. He begs for crates of .30 caliber rounds. His company is pinned down. The line is holding by a thread. Behind the counter, an officer looks up from a mahogany desk. He does not reach for a crate. He reaches for a clipboard. He points to a blank line on a sheet of paper. He tells the exhausted soldier to go back through the mortar fire and get a signature. If there is no form, there is no ammunition. This is a story of how General George Patton responded when bureaucratic arrogance became a death sentence. He would ensure that the man who loved paperwork finally understood the true cost of a missing signature. This is the story of a supply officer who valued regulations over the lives of his fellow soldiers and the decisive justice Patton delivered to remind him why the Army exists. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happens when arrogance writes the orders. STNDX Stop in First Lieutenant James Miller had seen enough. He was the executive officer of the infantry company, currently dying in the mud 2 miles away, and he had come to the supply point personally. After his runner returned empty-handed, he found the depot quiet. It felt like a different world. He looked at the man behind the desk and tried to keep his voice level. "Captain, my men are down to their last clips. I have 3 machine guns that are silent because they have nothing to feed the belts. I need 200 cases of ammunition, and I need them loaded onto my Jeep right now." Captain Albert Gruber did not look up from the ledger he was marking with a fountain pen. He finished his notation with a precise flick of the wrist before meeting the lieutenant's eyes. "You were informed of the requirements 10 minutes ago by your runner, Day Form 581. I need the unit designation, the specific quantity, the justification for expenditure, and 2 authorized signatures. 1 from you is insufficient. I need the commanding officer's signature as well. The lieutenant leaned over the desk, his hands shaking with a mix of exhaustion and rage. The commanding officer is currently occupied trying to keep a German counterattack from overrunning our command post. He doesn't have time to sign your paperwork. I am telling you, as an officer of the United States Army, that if those crates don't move, that line will collapse. People are dying while we stand here talking about a form. Gruber stood up. He smoothed the front of his jacket. His uniform was pressed so sharply the creases looked like they could draw blood. Lieutenant, regulations exist to ensure accountability. Without accountability, there is only chaos. I am responsible for every round in this depot. If I release 1,000 rounds without a properly formatted requisition, I am the one who answers to the Inspector General. No form, no ammunition. That is the regulation. Miller took a step forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You are more worried about a desk auditor in Washington than the men bleeding in a ditch 2 miles east of here. Is that the ideology you're running this depot on, Captain? Paper over people? Gruber didn't flinch. He gestured to the framed sign on his wall. Proper procedure prevents problems. Lieutenant, if your company cannot manage its administrative duties in the field, that is a failure of leadership on your end, not a failure of supply on mine. Now, go get the second signature or vacate the premises. You are obstructing the efficiency of this point. Miller looked at the stacks of ammunition crates behind the captain. He looked at the clean, dry floor of the office. He realized he wasn't talking to a soldier. He was talking to a clerk who happened to be wearing a uniform. He turned on his heel without another word. He didn't go back to the front. He went to the divisional radio. He didn't ask for a colonel. He asked for the 3rd Army commander. The report reached Patton within the hour. ST&DX stop, November 1944. A divisional ammunition supply point near Thionville, France. The air is heavy with the scent of damp earth and the metallic tang of diesel. Heavy rain turns the staging area into a sea of thick, sucking mud deep in the distance. The low rumble of artillery shakes the horizon. It is a constant, rhythmic pulse of war. A young American runner collapses against a stack of wooden crates, his lungs burning and his uniform soaked through with sweat and rainwater. He has no paperwork. He has only a desperate plea for the shells his brothers need to stay alive. The officer in charge looks at him with cold, detached eyes and points to an empty desk. He demands a signature before he will release a single bullet. It was a decision that prioritized a filing cabinet over a frontline. George S. Patton would ensure the paperwork was finished in a way the officer would never forget. Patton stood motionless as the order was carried out. 2 massive military police officers stepped forward and grabbed Captain Gruber by the elbows. They did not use handcuffs. They simply marched him toward the muddy perimeter of the depot, where the ammo crates were being loaded into a waiting truck. On Patton's signal, a sergeant handed a shovel to the officer. The refined Minneapolis man looked at the tool as if it were a foreign object. He was ordered to begin digging a trench. It was not a foxhole for defense. It was a physical manifestation of the grave his bureaucracy had nearly dug for a whole company. For the next 3 hours, Gruber labored in the freezing French rain. Every time he slowed down, an MP nudged him with a rifle butt. He was forced to dig in the same mud that Private Santos had sprinted through. While he dug, he watched the trucks roar away toward the front lines, filled with the ammunition he had tried to keep locked behind a signature. The other supply clerks watched in stunned silence, realizing that the old rules of the rear echelon were dead. The smell of wet wool and raw earth filled Gruber's nose as his hands began to blister and bleed. He was learning that in Patton's army, the only form that mattered was the one that kept a soldier firing. The high-gloss finish on his boots was gone, buried under the weight of the reality he had tried to ignore. What Patton did when a supply officer refused ammo to a company in contact because of a missing form, November 1944, a divisional ammunition supply point near Thionville, France. Rain turns the red clay into a thick, sucking soup that clings to every boot and truck tire. Inside a dry, heated wooden shack, a captain sits behind a desk neatly stacked with carbon copy papers. Outside, the low rumble of artillery shakes the window panes. But the office remains orderly. A young soldier bursts through the door, chest heaving, his uniform soaked through and splattered with mud. He reaches for a crate of M1 Garand clips stacked near the entrance. The captain looks up from his ledger, his eyes cold and unimpressed by the urgency. He places a hand on the paperwork in front of him and tells the boy to stop. He demands a form that does not exist in the mud of the front lines. George Patton will eventually see this desk, and he will ensure the man sitting behind it understands the true cost of a signature. November 1944. A divisional ammunition supply point near Thionville, France. The air is thick with the smell of wet wool and diesel exhaust. Rain turns the red clay of the French countryside into a thick, sucking soup. Trucks idle in long rows, their headlights dimmed by canvas covers. In the distance, the low rumble of artillery shakes the horizon. It is a constant, heavy vibration that rattles the windows of a small wooden shack. Inside that shack, a young soldier stands shivering. Water drips from the hem of his field jacket. He is breathing hard, his lungs burning from a 2-mile sprint through the mud. He gasps for air and reaches out a hand, asking for the one thing that can keep his brothers alive. He is met not with a crate of shells, but with a demand for a piece of paper. Patton will soon learn that while the enemy kills with lead, the bureaucrat kills with ink. This is the story of what happened when a supply officer prioritized paperwork over the lives of soldiers in combat. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happens when arrogance writes the orders. Some historians have argued that Patton's public humiliation of officers, like Gruber, was a performance designed to build a myth of a populist general who cared only for the common soldier. They suggest that regulations exist to ensure that resources are tracked across an entire army, preventing one company from hoarding what another might desperately need. Others argue that Patton was the only commander who truly understood the fluid, chaotic reality of modern mechanized warfare. They believe his intervention saved countless lives by reminding the bureaucracy that it exists to serve the front line, not the other way around. What is certain is that after this directive was issued, no soldier in the Third Army ever died because of a missing form again. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have simply retrained the officer in private? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happens when arrogance writes the orders, make sure to subscribe.